The clatter of my casserole dish hitting the cafeteria counter was probably louder than it needed to be. My hands, scrubbed raw from a morning of peeling potatoes, felt clumsy against the metal. He'd said it with such casual finality, as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, her? She's just a lunch lady." The words hung in the air between us, a greasy film settling over the already lukewarm conversation. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, a sensation I'd grown so adept at ignoring, a dull ache that had become a constant companion in this house. My normal was a carefully constructed facade. A tidy bungalow, a meticulously tended garden that bled color even in late autumn, and a quiet routine that revolved around the rhythm of the school day. Breakfast was usually a solitary affair, him already gone to his office, his presence only a ghost in the morning paper left carelessly strewn across the kitchen table. Dinners were strained silences punctuated by his pronouncements about his latest business triumphs, his disdain for anyone he deemed less successful. My mother, bless her heart, existed in a perpetual state of placid agreement, her gaze always a little too far away, lost somewhere in the rose-tinted memories of a past that felt increasingly unreal. He'd married her when I was already 18, a freshly minted adult navigating the confusing terrain of independence. He was older, established, and seemed, on the surface, to offer a semblance of stability. But stability, I'd learned, could be a gilded cage. He had a way of making my contributions feel insignificant. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was a raised eyebrow when I mentioned a small success at work, a particularly complex catering order smoothly executed, a new recipe I'd perfected. He'd nod, a patronizing little smile playing on his lips, and steer the conversation back to his own world. "That's nice, dear," he'd say, his voice dripping with a feigned politeness that was more insulting than outright contempt. I remembered once, a few years ago, after my mother had inherited a modest sum from her aunt, he'd spent an entire evening going over the paperwork, his eyes gleaming as he outlined potential investments. When I'd meekly suggested a portion could go towards a small art class I'd always dreamed of taking, he'd waved it away. "Art? What use is art? This is about securing our future, building something substantial." The implication was clear, my desires were frivolous, my aspirations beneath consideration. Then there was the time my mother had a minor surgery. She was anxious, frail. I'd taken time off work, stayed with her, cooked her meals, managed her medication. He'd visited briefly, a fleeting appearance with a bouquet of flowers and a perfunctory kiss on her cheek. Later, he'd remarked to me, his tone laced with an irritating superiority, "Honestly, darling, you're so good at looking after her. It's a shame your career isn't as nurturing." It was a jab disguised as a compliment, a cruel twist that highlighted his belief in my inherent subservience. Each instance was a tiny chip, a slow erosion of my self-worth, leaving me feeling hollowed out, a background character in my own life. I'd learned to compartmentalize, to build walls around my feelings, to channel my energy into the predictable, tangible world of food and service. It was a world where ingredients obeyed, where recipes yielded results, and where my efforts were, at least, acknowledged by hungry teenagers. That Tuesday had started like any other. The dawn painted the sky in muted grays and soft pinks as I prepped the ingredients for chili, the comforting aroma filling the kitchen. He was already at the dining table, poring over spreadsheets, his brow furrowed in concentration. My mother sat opposite him, a half-finished crossword puzzle before her, her fingers tracing the pattern of the tablecloth. The conversation was functional, a series of polite acknowledgments about the weather and the upcoming school bake sale. Then, the phone rang. It was my mother's solicitor. He listened intently, his face unreadable for a moment, before his lips curved into a tight, triumphant smile. He hung up, and the silence that followed was electric. He turned to my mother, his voice smooth, like polished marble. "Good news, my dear. Your cousin's estate has been settled. The distribution is, surprisingly generous." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. My mother blinked, her eyes wide with a mild surprise. He then turned to me, his gaze sweeping over my slightly flour-dusted apron, the faint scent of onions clinging to my clothes. The words tumbled out, unbidden, laced with a condescension that was sharper than any blade. Don't get any ideas, sweetheart. This is for your mother and me. You're just a lunch lady. This sort of thing is beyond your scope. The air in the room seemed to thicken, to press down on me. It wasn't just the insult, it was the unadulterated entitlement, the casual dismissal of my entire existence. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against my carefully constructed composure. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of passive acceptance, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. The dull ache in my chest ignited into a cold, hard resolve. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a chilling clarity, a sudden, fierce understanding that this man had underestimated me for the last time. The next few days were a blur of controlled action, conducted in the quiet hours when he was at work, or when the house was asleep. My lunch lady life, as he so dismissively called it, had inadvertently equipped me with a unique set of skills, meticulous planning, efficient execution, and an ability to work with limited resources under pressure. He was so used to my quiet acquiescence, my avoidance of confrontation, that he hadn't noticed the subtle shift in my demeanor. My usual morning greetings were still polite, my evening presence unobtrusive. But behind the placid surface, a meticulous strategy was unfolding. I started with the documents. The ones he'd spent so much time with, tracing imaginary lines of wealth and inheritance. I remembered seeing him stash a particular leather-bound ledger, a thick, impressive volume, in his study. He'd referred to it as his legacy planner. I waited for the perfect opportunity, a late night when he was out at a business dinner. The study was his sanctuary, filled with the scent of expensive leather and old paper. I bypassed the obvious drawers, my hands steady as I located the hidden compartment behind a framed photograph of him and my mother, looking impossibly young and happy. Inside, I found it. Not just one ledger, but several, meticulously organized. They detailed every property, every stock, every offshore account. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't need one, not in the way he thought. My mother, bless her, had always been the more pragmatic of her siblings, and before she'd married him, she'd meticulously sorted her own finances. Years ago, anticipating exactly this kind of entitled behavior, she'd transferred the bulk of her inherited wealth, including the recent settlement from her cousin, into a separate trust. A trust established for her children and grandchildren, with me named as the sole executor and trustee. It was a clause he'd either overlooked in his arrogance, or dismissed as a minor detail, assuming my mother would always defer to him. He'd been so focused on their future, he'd forgotten that my mother had a past, and a foresight he couldn't comprehend. The following Saturday, he was polishing his car in the driveway, humming a jaunty tune. My mother was in the garden, tending to her roses. I walked out, carrying a single, crisp manila envelope. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse or berate. I simply handed it to him. "This is for you," I said, my voice even. He took it, his eyebrows inching up in mild curiosity. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a summary of the trust, detailing the assets, the beneficiaries, and my role as executor. Below it, he saw the list of properties that were now solely under the trust's control, properties he'd always assumed were his to manage, to leverage, to eventually inherit. The humming stopped. His hand, which had been resting on the car bonnet, clenched. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty white. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now darted between the papers and my face, a flicker of disbelief, then dawning panic. He started to sputter, to form words that wouldn't quite come out. What is this? This can't be right." I met his gaze, my expression serene. "It's all there," I said, the words soft, but carrying the weight of finality. "Your financial advisor will have received the formal notification by now. All transfers are complete. As you said, I am just a lunch lady. My scope is limited to what's in this envelope. And thankfully, my mother saw fit to entrust it to me." I watched him, this man who had belittled and dismissed me, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him with a silent implosion. He looked utterly lost, a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of his own making. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in his distress, only a quiet, cold sense of justice. I turned, and walked back into the house, leaving him standing there, the crumpled envelope a stark white flag of surrender in his suddenly empty hands. The fallout was, as I'd anticipated, a symphony of chaos. His phone became a constant beacon of frantic calls and increasingly irate text messages. He tried to reach my mother, who, for the first time in years, simply answered the phone and said, "I believe you need to speak with my daughter, dear." Her quiet refusal to engage, her newfound boundary, was as effective as a slammed door. He attempted to leverage his friends, the sycophantic colleagues and business associates who'd always hovered around him. They, however, were remarkably unwilling to offer support when their own financial entanglements with him were suddenly called into question. His reputation, built on bluster and perceived wealth, began to unravel. Whispers turned into outright speculation. The generous settlement he'd so proudly announced now seemed like a very different kind of story. He tried to corner me, his face contorted with rage and a desperate plea for explanation. But the locks on his study, and indeed, on the main entrances to the house, had been changed. He found himself locked out of his own life, his access restricted to the small, insignificant room he'd insisted was mine. He was a man who had defined himself by his possessions, his power, his control. And I, the lunch lady, had calmly, quietly, dismantled it all. There was no shouting match, no dramatic showdown. Just the inexorable march of legal clauses and carefully prepared documents. He was left with the remnants of his ego, a tattered and bruised thing. The quiet of the house, once a source of his dominance, now echoed with his frustration and helplessness. He was relegated to the role he'd always assigned me, a peripheral figure, a nobody. The silence that now permeated our shared space was not empty, but heavy with the weight of his downfall. It was a silence I could finally breathe in.